Okay, glad to have with us City Council candidate Jesse Zwick. Jesse, great to have you. And do you want to just introduce yourself and talk about why you're running for City Council this year?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, John. My name is Jesse Zwick. I use he, him pronouns. I grew up in Santa Monica Canyon. Frankly, what got me into this is the issue of homelessness. I had returned back to Los Angeles and Santa Monica area after some years working and studying on the East Coast, and I was really just um, overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis and what had happened in our city, and I found myself unable to sort of sit by and do nothing as it continued to grow. So I involved myself really heavily in a homeless services nonprofit on the east side called SELA that was founded by my friend Nithya Raman. And I did that work almost every weekend for 5 years, doing homeless outreach, connecting with unhoused neighbors, building trusting relationships over time that led to a lot of people being connected to housing and services in my neighborhood in a way that I was really proud. But the truth is I was also really frustrated because no matter how much good work we did, the crisis continued to get worse. And I think, what drew me it slowly drew me more and more into the political process because I saw the ways in which our city was not pursuing the best policies and practices to get us out of this crisis. And politics is the arena in which these policies get fought out and decided. And I ended up quitting my day job working in television and running communications for Nithya Raman's campaign for city council in Los Angeles. And I went to City Hall with her and worked as her director of communications. And after she was sort of firmly set up in that office, I left to help a council member, Mike Bonin, when a right-wing recall was initiated against him, along with the recalls of Gavin Newsom and so many other progressive leaders in our state. And I think that time working with Mike and helping him in that moment of crisis was really formative for me because I was exposed in really close quarters to the extreme levels of toxicity and vitriol and other types of anger and resentment that have really been festering in our city. And I think it's so important that we solve homelessness, most of all, of course, for the unhoused people on our streets, those that are dying now 3 or 4, even 5 a day in LA County. But I also think it's really, really important that we start to make progress on this issue because that anger is giving rise to a new kind of politics, not just in Los Angeles, but in Santa Monica as well. And as I saw what had happened in 2020, after 2020 and the election in Santa Monica, when I had moved back here with my young son, I was really dismayed by the direction the city was going. And I feel strongly that, again, the challenge here is that the anger that people feel and that is sort of fueling the anger and resentment and fear that is fueling this new politics is the truth is some of it's legitimate. We haven't completely been able to get a handle on these crises. And if we don't redouble our efforts and come up with new solutions and try new things and elect people who will be able to pull this off, I really believe that nothing less than the progressive soul of our city and all of the policies that we fought so hard for over 3 to 4 decades in the city are at stake. So that's why I'm running. I frankly, 5 years ago, I would not have ever predicted that I would be here in this room talking to you, saying I wanted to do this job. I got into this work because I cared about the issue of homelessness. I'm doing it because this is how I think I can best help. And if you're looking for someone, obviously, who is the longest tenured member of the Santa Monica political scene, that's not me. But if you want someone who I believe can bring together both old and new in our city, some of our oldest, deepest held values, but also some of our newest policy solutions, and bring together different groups of people and defeat the sort of right-wing forces of anger, fear, and resentment that have really been fueling politics in this city, I think I'm your guy. I've been endorsed by Sheila Kuehl and Gleam Davis, Abby Arnold, and Leslie Lambert, and my old bosses, Mike Bonin and Nithya Raman. I enjoy really strong relationships with them, and I think of them as mentors. And it would be an honor to try to represent the Santa Monica Democrats as well in that fight. So thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. So I wanted to ask you about that's a good starting point. So you have a lot of really impressive experience within campaigning, which is important for us as Democrats, with Nithya, with Mike. Can you point to a specific area where you were involved in implementation of public policy from more of like a governance perspective or policy perspective rather than a campaign context? Where do you think is like your biggest success in that department?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that, these issues of politics and policy and policy and communications are so wrapped up together in that, you need the best policy, but you also need to sell it in the best way, and you need to build the coalitions that you need around it. And I'd say that, because I was there very early on in Nithya's office, I had my hand in both the policy and the politics and communication side of things. And in fact, for the first 4 months in City Hall, I was handling both the legislative affairs and the communications in her office. And one of the issues that came up early on, well, there were two big issues that I think I was really spearheading for Nithya Raman's office. The first had to do with a tenant anti-harassment ordinance, which was on the docket in Los Angeles. There's already a strong one, obviously, in Santa Monica, and it was actually a version of the law that we looked at closely when we advocated for changes to strengthen it. But it was a very difficult situation. There were a number of sides in that conflict around whether to strengthen the ordinance when it had already been in committee, when it had already gone through many months of process and ordinance writing before we'd even been elected. But we felt it was really important to add key protections in it for tenants that currently didn't exist in the law as it was written in Santa Monica. Things around imposing vacancy control as a penalty on landlords who successfully or who were found to have harassed or otherwise forced people out of their units as a disincentive for landlords for doing that. Other issues around I'm trying to think of the other specifics in that issue around private right of action for attorneys so that they could actually enforce this law, because often, our city agencies, especially in Los Angeles, were not up to the task of doing that administratively. And, we had to build not just the actual legislative changes to the ordinance, which I helped write and propose, but we also had to build a case for that. And we went to ACE and the Inner City Law Center and CES and every group, and we made videos and we rallied them and we rallied support so much that, we weren't the chair of that committee. It was Gilbert Cedillo, and he didn't want to make those changes, but we got his own people to call in and pressure him on it. And I think we came up with a stronger ordinance that better reflected, one that's closer to Santa Monica's and the real protection for tenants. And obviously the other biggest issue that we dealt with the entire time there was rent relief for and otherwise rent freeze and other ways to keep tenants in their homes during COVID. And, I negotiated with the staff of Nuri Martinez's office for months over what kind of package would be put in place for tenants. And, we initially started out with the proposal from Healthy LA around actually allowing the city to cancel rents. But, when it became clear that we weren't going to be able to win a majority of votes on the council for that, we continued to persist in conversation with Nuri's office for months and months to say, okay, well, how big can we make this package? How can we make sure that it's actually taken up by the most vulnerable members of, Los Angeles, and not just those who are most savvy? How can we make sure that those who are undocumented or otherwise might normally not participate, how do we lower the threshold to participation so as people will not be afraid and will actually participate in these relief programs? And, I'd say that ideologically, we didn't always see eye to eye with Council President Martinez's office in any way, but Nithya was intent on us negotiating and being in the room and having an influence on every policy, regardless of whether we had a majority or not, so that we would be able to leave our mark on it. And I was instrumental in both of those policies.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Melissa.
Hi, Jesse.
Hello.
I'm going to change gears, though it was nice to hear about that policy experience. I would love to know how your perspective as a young parent will impact your priorities and your approach if you're elected to city council.
Yeah, John likes that one.
I thought he would.
I think it does. It impacts it quite a lot, and I think I had these beliefs and convictions that I already felt quite strongly about. But I think in some ways, I would say that having a kid might have been what pushed me over the edge to actually having the courage to throw my hat in and really put my money where my mouth is and live my values in this sense. And I think that for the most part, what I see in the city is a divide to some extent between a number of people who I think, for lack of a better phrase, want to make Santa Monica 1950 again in some way. They have a rose-colored vision of the past, and it's one that frankly wasn't actually very kind to a lot of minorities and other groups, but they see as a more golden age. And I think of myself as looking to see what kind of, how we can make Santa Monica the best city possible by 2050, because we don't have a time machine to go back. We only can go in one direction. We have to acknowledge that we've become a big city with big city problems and come up with real solutions that are, urban in nature to solve them. And I think having a kid, obviously makes you that much more forward thinking, where I say to myself every day, I can barely afford, I'm a very privileged person. I'm having trouble affording to live in the city. Where will my son be able to live? I care a lot about climate change. Santa Monica is one of the few places in LA that still has a mild climate. And, this week, as the heat wave comes in, I'm very happy to live in Santa Monica. But that's, every year it's getting worse everywhere. And, what kind of climate will my son live in? And I think those are very, very important and motivating questions for me that I think caused me to want to step up and do this.
Thank you.
Let's go to Dan.
Thanks, John. Hey, Jesse. You intimated in your last answer that, the 1950s, the 1960s in Santa Monica were not kind to people of color, particularly Black and Brown community members in the Pico neighborhood and Belmar and frankly, all across the city. What specific steps would you lead the effort in the city to, address some of those wrongs that this city has done in the past?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely, I have a number of things I'm thinking about. The first, I guess I would touch upon would be issues of environmental justice and the Pico neighborhood and its proximity to the 10 freeway, ways that the average amount of air pollution and particulates from brake pads and exhaust pipes and things like that are definitely having a negative impact on those that live closest to the freeway. Think about the equitable or actually inequitable distribution of tree canopies, which is the case everywhere, but including in parts of Santa Monica, access to tree canopy and green space, which plays a huge role in our heating and cooling needs. And I think of it, but I think of it a lot in terms of fair housing. Frankly, I think I support the program that the city has started around specifically trying to locate some of the people that were displaced by the 10 freeway and actually inviting them back to live in our city or otherwise pay some form of reparations. But I think that beyond that, I really think when it comes to our housing policy, we need to think really hard about not just righting wrongs of the past, but also coming up with opportunities actively in the present for more people of color to live in our city, more low-income people of color who work here already to be able to live here. Because one of the number one things that we can do as a city is simply allow more low-income people to live here, because they will immediately live in what is a high or highest resource neighborhood and be able to send their kids to an excellent public school and be able to have their kids grow up in a place where they're less likely to get asthma. And if we're talking about what we could do that would be most impactful for low-income people of color in our greater community of Southern California, it would be to create more housing opportunities that allow people who already donate their labor here, people who commute here every day, to have the opportunity to live here and take advantage of those resources. And that, I think, would be the number one thing we could do to help low-income people of color take advantage of those resources that we have here on offer.
Anybody have the next question? Okay, Jesse, what is your approach, or what would your approach be with regard to the city meeting our RENA goals, specifically the 6,000 affordable housing units that need to be created?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real challenge. It's a high number of deed restricted affordable housing that Santa Monica is expected to build by the end of the decade. I mean, my first approach is simply to take a different one that our current council, from which our current council has taken, and actively try hard to build solutions, build coalitions, and create policies to reach it, as opposed to think about how best to undermine that target, how best to fight with the state. I think that if we want to maintain local control over our zoning and land use decisions, we need to actively plan as a community for the future and try hard to meet those goals and demonstrate that good faith. And that's the way we're going to be able to maintain a degree of autonomy over what kind of development happens in our city. As far as specifics, first of all, of course, I do support the ballot measure that was put forward with citizens' signatures and supported by, I believe, you, John, and the mayor and Denny Zane and others. I believe that the transfer tax will help raise crucial funds that we can then leverage against state and federal resources to build a large number of affordable units. I don't believe necessarily that the amount of funds will necessarily get us all the way to 6,000. The housing element draft that I read estimated that the amount of public resources to build those 6,000 units would be north of $4 billion all in. So I think we have to get really creative. I think we have to both leverage our fund, our city funds, our city land against any state and federal funding that we can get for this purpose. And I also think, frankly, we do have to leverage private sector investment as well and come up with rules of the road that incentivize investment, but make sure that we are capturing as much of that value as possible in the form of deed restricted affordable housing in our city.
Cool. Anyone else have another question? Okay, I'll give you
I
one
see
more.
Dolly raising her hand.
I'm sorry, I didn't see Dolly. Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, mute.
The invisible Dolly. Hi there.
Hello.
Yes. In your replies, you mentioned your concern, which is really great, about folks who can't afford to pay the rent being given consideration and some kind of public policies that take care of them so they don't become homeless and so forth. I'm wondering, I never see in any of these replies answers about how people like me can afford to stay in the city, who has 2 master's degrees, a history of very high level employment. But still, if I need to move, which may happen soon or I'll be Ellis, I could not afford to stay here. And yet I give a lot to the city. So not that I'm so great, but there are many people like me. So what would you suggest to keep people like me in the city?
Well, yeah, I think that there's a number of groups that are struggling. There are young people struggling to get a foothold. There are old people on a fixed income who are having to face cost of living increases. And, I know the city currently has a program that I support, which we could do more in, which is its POD program, which specifically gives rental assistance to rent burdened seniors in our city. If you're speaking specifically to your situation where you might be facing an Ellis eviction, I think that there are policies that I think we can be working on. I think there is some of this already, but I know that there's some issues around it where we need to be prioritizing longtime residents of our city, those that are at the risk of displacement or Ellis eviction or otherwise, to be first in line for new affordable housing that comes online. And I know that occasionally when it comes to getting state and federal funding for that housing, it can be legally thorny in terms of how you prioritize people on that list. But I think to the legal, to the furthest extent possible by the law, we should be prioritizing longtime members of our community, those in the Pico neighborhood who are being displaced, elderly members who are getting displaced, and that if people are facing an Ellis eviction, we need to come up with a process where those people are on the top of our list for affordable housing openings in our city.
As a point of privilege, I'm going to tell you that they actually are at the top of the list. If you get Ellis, and you income qualify, you automatically are at the very top of the affordable housing below market list.
Well, then I guess Santa Monica has already come up with something on that, Frank, on that account. And thank you, Patricia, for that. But
What do you say?
We're working on it.
Yeah.
It's not enough. The first thing I say when somebody tells me that they've been Ellis'd is, who did you get the letter from? And if you got the letter from your landlord, you have not been Ellis'd. And the first thing to know is, don't believe it just because someone tells you you're Ellis'd. Unless you get the letter from the Rent Control Board, you have not been Ellis'd.
That is a good point, and it speaks to another element of this, which is that I do believe that we should have a codified right to counsel for any person who is facing eviction in their unit, because most of the time there are legal recourses, and the statistics on this are stunning, where people facing eviction without a lawyer are evicted almost 90% of the time, and when they have good legal representation, I believe it declines to around 9%.
Dolly,
I just want, I really appreciate your answer, but that wasn't the point of my question. It's people who do not, who make too much to be on the affordable housing list, but don't make enough to rent.
Okay.
I'm not talking about the Ellis folks.
I see. Okay. I definitely understand that, because I think that there are so many people in our city like you, like the majority of our teachers, nurses, cops, or otherwise, people who make up the backbone of a lot of our city's, staff and services, and who are in that exact position where they have a salary that isn't entitled them to low or extremely low income housing, but they're still not able to make market rate rents in the current moment. And I think that's where I do think we need to look at legalizing different forms of housing that can accommodate to what we call missing middle housing. Buildings that are more duplexes and fourplexes and 8 and 10 unit buildings that might be more naturally affordable if we allow them to be built, say, without the same onerous parking requirements, without the huge massing of lots that is required for these larger luxury buildings, but instead we look at sort of new materials like mass timber, new styles of building like single staircase, things that we now realize we can do. That's things that were at one point banned because we said, oh, they're a fire risk, but we now realize we have modern methods that we could actually employ to build that kind of missing middle housing in our city, so that our the people that honestly, I don't want to live in a city that is all multimillionaires and in a symbolic percentage of extremely poor people. I want people of all incomes to be able to live here. And I think part of it has to do with legalizing more forms of housing that can be more naturally affordable in how they're built in terms of the price per square foot, so that they could actually be rented out at affordable rates.
Thank you.
All right, Jesse, thanks so much for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you all so much for having me. Really appreciate getting to talk to you all.
Thank you, Jesse.
Okay.